This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us at WZRD via Zoom NEIU, Northeastern Illinois University alumna and very prolific author, Richard Lindberg. How are you today, Richard?
Good morning, Trudy. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Richard, it's not super important, but usually wizards remain anonymous try to remain anonymous while we're on the air. So you could just address me as Miss Wizard while we're on the air.
Okay, be happy to.
All right, thank you. Well, first of all, Richard, why don't you give us a little background about how you started your writing and your experience at the NEIU, your mentor, your relationship with your mentor, how he helped you become an author, and why you chose to the road that you chose.
Well, I have been a writer and author for much of my life. I started writing at the age of 11 by keeping a diary journal, a practice I still keep today. I have published 20 books since 1978 when I first was published. Writing has been an avocation of mine since I was a kid. And I've been very fortunate to have a number of mentors along the way. I graduated from Northeastern in 1974. While there, I was a reporter for the original newspaper, campus newspaper, which was at that time called The Print. And really, I guess at Northeastern, I kind of decided at that point that I really wanted to become a writer, specifically a book author. I majored in history. I got a bachelor's and master's from the university and developed many wonderful relationships over the years, including one with Dr. Bernard Brommel, who was one of my early mentors and championed my work for many, many years and had encouraged me to write the first institutional history of Northeastern, which was published in 2017, called Northeastern Illinois University, the first 150 years. I'm very proud of that book. It really takes the story all the way back to 1867, when the first normal school, as they used to be called, which is what teacher colleges were known in those days, up through the modern era. And along the way, I've written 19 other books about Chicago history, sports, politics, city government, ethnic neighborhoods, and so forth.
How long did it take you to write the volume about Northeastern Illinois University?
The project began with real baby steps initially. Bernie Brommel wanted a history of the university written. And he approached me, I would say about 2011 and asked me to do it. And he said, Rich, he said, you're the most published author Northeastern has ever produced. So we would like you to do that. And I said, well, okay, let's first find out if we have the sign off from the administration. And that took another year or two. Dr. Sharon Haas, then president of the university, signed off on the project with the hope that it would be published in the anniversary year of 2017. So really, it was about 3 years worth of intensive research because there had not been a history of Northeastern published in book length form before. So it was almost an exhaustive project going through the Northeastern archives, interviewing alumni and students and emeritus faculty and current administration. But it was a much rewarding project, and it was released in 2017.
So of all the topics that you covered in that book, what would be the part that your readers were which part affected your readers the most, would you say?
Well, of course, the more recent chapters dealing with the more modern era had currency with the readership, particularly a number of the professors and adjunct faculty. They were very interested in how I interpreted different events at Northeastern, really from the 1970s onward. Uh, I was a student at Northeastern in the early 70s, and then I returned in the 1980s to get my master's degree in history. And of course, each of them had interesting stories to relate to me. And so, yes, the greatest interest was in the more current periods, but that's understandable.
Mhm. And how were you able to write objectively so that you included like the different sides and then without the without much controversy? Or were you able to how did you deal with any controversy?
Well, I had to really take a very neutral stance.
Hmm.
Uh, when I was a student in the 70s, it was a time of great activism on campus.
Hmm.
The Vietnam War was raging. There was conflict between minority students and the administration. Uh, there was always it was always a political kerfuffle going on at Northeastern, and I recall that. And Northeastern, has had its share of controversies, but what I tried to do was stand apart from all of that. Just portraying the university in the greatest light possible, because Northeastern's mission has always been geared towards assisting and representing students of lesser economic circumstances, and it paved the way for generations of young people to get their degree. Economically challenged families who could not afford private universities. Northeastern, the beauty of the whole thing is that it gave an opportunity to people such as me and so many thousands more to earn their degree. And I had no problems with anybody who had read the book. I received virtually zero criticisms from anyone. I just tried to interpret the events from a non-judgmental standpoint, and just tried to present the facts and let the reader evaluate, and form their own opinions.
When you uh, used so was it more of a journalistic interpretation of NEIU history, or was it more of a historical perspective that you applied to the work?
Well, it blends deep history and a journalistic approach. I am a historian. I'm a trained historian who has written extensively about Chicago history. So the early years, really from 1867 up through World War II, was a historical retrospective of the major events, the personalities. It was a story essentially of the normal school, which evolved into Chicago State University. I think of Northeastern as a gigantic oak tree with two large branches. One branch was the normal school Chicago State branch, and the other one was the Northeastern Illinois University branch. The campus really was started in 1960 when the buildings went up. So at that point, there occurred a split between the South Side campus and Northeastern. Essentially, these were two sister universities, but they kind of split apart at that point, and Northeastern obtained its own identity, first as a teachers' college, and then in 1971 as a university.
What were some of the facts in the book that you found that were not available anywhere else?
Well, for example, there's very little historical information about the first principal of Northeastern, Daniel Wentworth, who was often confused with Chicago Mayor Long John Wentworth. But Daniel Wentworth really was, at that time, they were called principals before they became university presidents. And it was really through his mission and vision that kind of defined the character and tempo of Northeastern as a teacher's college. The other thing that was so remarkable to me was the changing mores in the culture of teaching. Um, Even as late as the 1920s, uh, when you looked at class pictures of graduating classes, you would find maybe only one or two men, and the rest of the class was all women, because society had channeled the role of teaching to women. It was not a profession that really was open to men. Um, and that didn't really begin to change until the 1950s. Uh, uh, Women were kind of stereotyped as teachers. And the interesting thing about that is that the rules of the Chicago Board of Education prohibited women in the profession of teachers from marrying. And if they had to marry, or if they wanted to marry, essentially they had to quit their jobs. It was seen as a profession for a single woman, and um, Northeastern had a difficult time even in the 1920s and 30s, and I should say Northeastern slash Chicago State slash the Chicago Normal School, in getting enough men to participate in team sports. On the old campus in Englewood, they had sports programs, but there were not enough male students to actually almost complete teams. I mean, but they somehow managed to do it. But again, as the time passed, more and more men became involved in teaching and in educational administration, so that by the 1950s and 60s, the numbers had almost reached an equilibrium.
Hmm. And what was the reason for the lack of participation in sports in Englewood?
Well, it was because there weren't enough men to fill out the teams. Northeastern, well, actually, the Englewood campus, though, by the 1950s, had a very outstanding basketball program, and they were quite successful in the 1950s. But it was a process of evolution. There were teams, sports teams, by the time of World War I and through the 1920s and 30s, but the athletic program at the normal campus in Englewood really didn't begin getting its wings until the 1950s.
And at that time, at the normal campus, was it mostly a teaching college, or were there other subjects involved? Is that
Well,
the? Mhm.
essentially, it was a teachers' college almost
Mm.
exclusively. Um, in the 1950s, during the baby boom years after World War II, there was a chronic shortage of teachers. And the situation became so dire and desperate uh, that they were essentially giving away free tuition and free education to anyone who could qualify and pass the admissions test and enter a teaching program. They had aspiring students who would agree to become teachers in the Chicago public school system, were guaranteed basically a free education and a degree. And from there, they moved on into Chicago public schools. Northeastern and its sister school on the south side were feeder colleges for future teachers. It wasn't until the late 60s and early 1970s when the focus began to shift away from the normal school concept into general liberal arts education universities. There's an interesting study of that, uh, that in the decade, probably beginning in 1960 and continuing over the next 20 years, the exclusive teachers' colleges, then called normal schools, began to disappear all across the country. They converted into state-run universities, liberal arts, science, mathematics, business. Northeastern's business school really got going in the early 1980s. They didn't have much of a program when I was there as an undergraduate in the early 70s. But the normal school concept be defined as a French word, école normale. It was a French term that was used for the first educational institutions for teachers. And so the word became associated with teachers' colleges in the United States in the 19th century.
So there became more men in the Englewood School when men became more interested in teaching. But however, when we were talking about the men and the school sports, were there any sports for women, and did the men's sports develop after there were more men that enrolled in the normal school?
Oh, of course, uh, athletic programs mostly catered to women in the early years in the 1910s, 1920s. Yes, there were basketball teams, track teams, and so forth. Um, the school never really had a football program, but intramurals, basketball, running, swimming, yes, those participatory sports were there and were mostly oriented towards female students. Uh, the basketball program became essentially a men's dominated sport in the 1950s.
And when did the NEIU move away from sports? Because when I served at the SGA, Student Government Association, we wanted to bring the sports back, but how did we move away from sports?
Well, there was a conundrum at Northeastern regarding sports. There were people in the athletic department and many students who wanted uh, to really kind of upgrade the program. The new athletic building came in the early 1980s, and there was a movement to try to turn Northeastern into a Division I school. Um, that, however, was strongly opposed by a number of faculty members who reasonably argued that Northeastern did not have the financial wherewithal to compete with schools that had traditional and very successful team sports programs. After all, this is a commuter school. It was never a residential campus until the last few years, and so many of the students worked 30 or 40-hour week jobs along with the academic programs they were taking towards their degree. It served mostly in its original concept students from the Chicago bungalow neighborhoods of the North Side and the Northwest Side. At least that was the case when I was there. And sports was kind of an afterthought. But beginning in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the school entered into a Division I phase, but they could not recruit or attract the top athletes that would make the program very successful because they were going to out-of-state universities, Big Ten schools. So it was never really an ideal fit for Northeastern to become a sports-oriented school. It had its mission, and its mission was to serve students from the Chicago area, the surrounding communities, and more recently out of state and overseas. And it returned to that mission really under Dr. Salmi Steinberg, who made notable contributions when she was president of the university and decided against continuing the Division I program. And I think it was a very sound and wise decision that she made.
Mhm. When did Northeastern start recruiting more of the international students?
Well, that was long past the time I was there. The thrust of that began in the 1980s and escalated into the 1990s, especially when Dr. Steinberg had taken over as president. She encouraged in tremendous ways to open up the campus to students from around the world. And really, I think from what I can determine, Northeastern has become a multicultural international university. And that is quite a remarkable change from what I remember in the early 1970s, because at that time, when I was a student, essentially all of these kids came from Northwest Side high schools, Steinmetz and Schurz and Taft, and some of the North suburban high schools. That was essentially the student body. But by 20 years after that, the percentage of minority students had increased tenfold. Uh, and my recent trips to campus over the last 10 years or so and 20 years, I've just seen just a remarkable transformation of the school from its original identity to becoming really a university for the world.
When did you say that the diversity of the university increased tenfold?
Yes,
So,
from the 1970s up through the 2000s. Yes, it certainly did. Um, we had we had a number of Hispanic and African American students in the 1970s, but predominantly the student population in the 1960s and in the early 70s were mostly white ethnic kids from the surrounding neighborhoods of the Northwest Side and the North Side, of course. But but you know the times changed quite remarkably over the following 30 years.
when the students became more diverse, were those on account of the student population from areas outside the Northwest Side, or was the Northwest Side also diversifying, or was it predominantly the international students coming in?
Well, Northeastern encouraged minority enrollment by opening up their South Side campus. And that really turned out to be a catalyst for recruitment of African American students. Uh, Opportunities blossomed for minority students that had not existed much earlier. Uh, the international scope, I think, is of more recent vintage, arguably more so in the from the time of the new millennium up till now. Um, I think that Northeastern's identity has really evolved in just remarkable ways since that time.
Mhm. We also welcome right now Bill Morton. He's a fellow wizard broadcaster, and also he is the president of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce and has worked with um, uh, worked a lot in diversity for the community. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Miss Wizard, and I really appreciate being here today. I was just wondering how you do your research for your material. Are you speaking with historical societies, museums, other authors? Where do you get your what is your resource for your information?
Well, each book and each subject matter is unique and individual, but by and large, I try to exhaust all resources that are available to me. If I'm writing about distant Chicago history from the 19th century, I use the Chicago History Museum, the Newberry Library, and the Chicago Public Library as a tremendous resource. I build the framework of that kind of history around what I can find on the newspapers of the era that are still online, or more often I end up at the Chicago Public Library, the main branch where all the Chicago newspapers from all eras are on microfilm. In more recent subject matter, I will reach out to people who were actively involved in the subject matter. Really, it's almost like an archaeological treasure hunt. You pick up a rock and you look underneath it, and you never know what you can find. Uh, Oral history is very important, but I primarily interest myself with early Chicago history from the time of the Civil War up through the Great Depression. That was the area of specialization that I had at Northeastern when I was working for my master's degree.
Could you just for interest's sake, could you tell us a little bit about the Chicago fire and maybe those sidewalks that were made of wood back in the day?
Well, I give presentations on the Chicago fire as the pivotal event in city history. The city was made of wood, and really there was a divergence once the fire came, separating old Chicago from the modern day. The Chicago fire resulted from a tinderbox of wooden architecture, wooden sidewalks, wooden buildings. And it was an exceptionally dry summer, and there had been fires all over the city for much of those early months or mid months of the year. Finally, the fire erupted in October of 1871, but really it was the seminal pivotal event separating ancien Chicago from the modern age, because after that, a remarkable school of architects arrived in the city to rebuild with steel frame and concrete and masonry, and to try to make the city a fireproof city. And by and large, that really was the birth of modern Chicago.
And how did the Chicago fire affect the history of Northeastern Illinois University?
Well, the school was pretty far removed from the concentration of the fire. The school started in Blue Island, Illinois, and then it moved to Englewood, but the fire did not reach as far south as Englewood. Essentially, it really only went as far south as Roosevelt Road, which was then called 12th Street. So the Chicago Normal School was pretty much unaffected by the fire, although it had a drop in enrollment, of course, because at that time it presented family hardships for people who couldn't go to college, and but other than that, there was no destruction of any kind of property.
And how about the Chicago flag? I know that one of the colors represents the turning of the Chicago River, one for the Chicago fire, and there's the Meridian stars, which many people don't understand.
Well, each of those stars signify an important event in Chicago history. The 1893 World's Fair, the Fort Dearborn. Then it's not politically correct to call it the Fort Dearborn Massacre anymore, but that was the destruction of the fort and the killing of the settlers that lived there. The World's Columbian Exposition, the Century of Progress in 1933, and the fort. Those four stars signify those pivotal events. There is some talk that a fifth star could and should be added to symbolize the launch of Special Olympics in Chicago, which began in 1968 under the auspices of Mayor Daley and Alderman Ed Burke's wife, Ann Burke, who really was the founder of Special Olympics as we know it today. And that is also one of the chapters in my book, Tales of Forgotten Chicago.
And then the Indian boundary line. I live in Rogers Park, and we have the Indian boundary line, and we have a little marker on one of the walls behind this electrical box. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, you might have to help me on this, but I think by and large it was the demarcation point before the resettlement of the native tribes in 1830, 32, 33, when the tribes were resettled west of the Mississippi River. In some respects, it was called the Trail of Tears, but the government had specified various demarcation points for tribal settlement, and to the best of my knowledge, that would explain the Indian boundary line up in Rogers Park. But I do stand corrected if you have another thought on that.
Well, I do know that there's some upcoming controversy, much like the Christopher Columbus statues about, and DuSable and Lakeshore Drive kind of thing. But that's not what I'm referring to at all. I was just wondering about the history, what you knew about the history.
Well, actually, I probably couldn't speak to that with any great degree of authority, though. Sorry.
when you were doing all your research, Richard, how did you file the facts? Because there are so many facts for you to put together.
Could you restate that just briefly?
Oh, when you were doing your research, what was your system for filing facts? Because there are so many facts for you to keep track of. And did you have a system that helped you
Oh,
get everything straight?
well, I consider myself a Luddite. Basically, my system has always been utilizing banker boxes and manila folders for clippings, and I sort it all by subject matter. I have a number of banker boxes in storage, usually banker boxes for each of the books I have written. I keep my notes, I keep my interview files, uh, newspaper clippings, articles that I have found, and whatever other miscellaneous items that come along to me. It rather than digitizing everything, I can just quickly refer to it. I know where it is. I have my own system of filing and storage, and I don't ever want to get rid of it. I do hope at one point to donate it to a historical archive, but that is really how I collect my information. Um, I I really began all my work in the pre-computer era, so I prefer to stick with the old kinds of methods of gathering material and filing it.
You mentioned oral history, speaking with people who were there, or maybe the grandparents who had, the grandchildren who had stories from their grandparents, or something like that. Um, what is an example of maybe something you learned from oral history that you did not learn from maybe the Newberry Library archives?
Well, one of the things that's interesting about oral history and the recollections of people of an advanced age looking back upon an event that they were either witness to or participated in is that the passage of time tends to exaggerate uh, the subject matter to great degrees. For example, doing sports research, I've written several books about the Chicago White Sox. I do a lot of work for them as their team historian, and interviewing a lot of older fans about events that had occurred in the 1920s and 1930s while they were still alive. They would greatly embellish the story. Uh, for example, they would say, "Oh, I was at the ballpark that day. There were 50,000 people in the stands." I would go back to the newspaper to verify that and would find out there were only 5,000 people. You cannot always trust uh, the living record and memory of people because memory fades, and if it tends to be a significant event uh, in their life, they often tend to exaggerate what they saw and versus what actually happened. So I try to verify and double check everything that I have heard uh, uh, from people that I have interviewed. Uh, I'm actually more often interested in their opinions about the event as opposed to their recollection of how it went down. I like to know their thoughts on how it impacted their lives, if it was a political event, how it shaped their thinking, that kind of thing. Because the human memory is fallible, and as I said, sometimes things become blown greatly out of proportion from what we know to be the reality from the printed record.
And one of the items that has historical or significant reference in the city of Chicago, one of the big things that has staying power are the buildings. They last for a very long time. I love historical architecture and the architecture of the city of Chicago, the ornamentation, the terracotta, even the terrazzo. Could you tell me a little bit about some time when you visited some historical architecture for your research?
I I visit historic architecture all over the city. I conduct bus tours for the Chicago History Museum, related to famous crime scenes in Chicago. In fact, I'm doing 2 of them in October and November of this year. But rather than dwell upon the architecture per se on how it was built, the steel frame versus the masonry concrete base to the buildings, I think buildings come alive when you imagine the people that live there. When I'm downtown, I like to just walk through the Monadnock building on Dearborn Street because it is such a classical early example of Chicago skyscrapers. And the building is remarkably preserved. The old elevators are in place. The little offices with the smoked glass windows are still there. And when you're in that building, you can almost think of yourself as being in the 1890s and seeing people of that era. Going through neighborhoods, for example, the old gray and brownstone walk-up buildings that still survive that have ornamentation on the terracotta above the windows. These were places where the ordinary people lived, and they speak volumes. And I just wish at times that I could just somehow talk to the people of past generations that lived and worked there. Because to me, buildings are more of a human representation than they are of an architectural style. At least that's where the importance lies.
And as far as development is concerned within the city, there's a big difference between the north side and the south side. Could you tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that, the difference between the north and the south side?
Well, I've always said that Chicago is perhaps the most, as they say, balkanized city in the world. Patterns of racial and ethnic segregation persist today, and literally were carved out of the period beginning at the end of the Chicago fire. The Chicago Relief and Association, when it was rebuilding the city, served the needs and wants of its most affluent citizens in the rebuilding, post-fire rebuilding, whereas many of the tenement dwellers and ethnic immigrants from Eastern Europe were housed in ramshackle buildings of wood that were thought to only be there temporarily until these generations of people moved onward and upward. Unfortunately, they remained dens of poverty for decades to come. And really, it wasn't until the 1940s, when the first process of urban renewal began, that some of these post-fire buildings, these ramshackle tenements, were finally torn down. South Side and North Side really almost are two different worlds. The South Side and the West Side were settled first. They are the oldest neighborhoods in the city, and almost as a result, many of them became the most neglected neighborhoods of the city. The North Side sparkles with its entertainment centers, its restaurants, its dining, its Gold Coast, its upscale housing, whereas the South Side has always been a working man's kind of community, working women, if you will, living in reduced economic circumstances. Southsiders, it's interesting to me, particularly white ethnic Irish and Italians, will identify their neighborhoods by their parish. Oh, where do you live? Well, I grew up in St. Rita. And that would tell you all you need to know about their economic circumstances, about their lives, because you just formed a picture of the St. Rita parish. But that doesn't happen on the North Side. On the North Side, when somebody asks you that question, you say, oh, I went to Steinmetz High School. You kind of identify yourself by the high school you went with on the North Side, and that will tell you about the circumstances and the people who live there. Because these neighborhoods are so ethnically stratified and racially segregated. And that, again, is a consequence of post-fire urban planning.
And history is always moving forward. And I was wondering also, what parts of history do you feel are endangered? Whether it be buildings or streets or maybe documents, like have you been through old moldy documents to do your research?
Yes, many archives are in very sad shape. For many years, I was a member of the Chicago Crime Commission. And when I was doing research into Chicago crime from early in the 20th century, I found that their paper and their history was buried in the basement at 79 West Monroe. Loose paper, archival documents going back to the 1920s were collecting dust and debris from the plaster in the ceiling falling apart. And I asked about, well, how can this be saved? Well, it requires digitization, which is a multi-million-dollar project to take that much paper and conserve it by creating electronic files. But fortunately, they were able to do a lot of that work. And that is a challenge that faces so many institutions, not only public sector, but in private sector businesses. They lose their history. Sometimes in the business world, companies just throw away this paper because they don't see it as history. And I do some occasional writing. I do some writing of archival histories for corporations and institutions. And when I ask about their archive, they say, "Oh, we don't really have anything; it's all gone." So how do you work from there? It becomes very difficult. Are we losing our history? I think the greater issue I have with that subject matter, and it's very controversial. I'm a traditionalist, and I think the history of the period, the political, social attitudes and mores should be looked upon as being contemporary to the time in which it happened. Those of us in the 21st century, the cause historians, need to judge and evaluate groups of people by the way they lived at the time, and not to impose 21st century sensibilities upon the past. If we do that, we're in some ways we are erasing our history. And I think that's a very dangerous and scary thing to do. We live in a highly charged, volatile political climate, but I think that the preservation of our history also involves the preservation of societal opinions and attitudes of the particular time. And I think that for readers of history, it's important that the reader make up his mind, and it's the historian's task to not so much interpret it by 21st century values, but to present the attitudes and issues as they happened and allow the reader to make that decision.
And I guess I'll give you one more. A lot of people are confused about between the 50 wards and the communities of the city of Chicago. Can you make a disambiguation for us?
Well, that has everything to do with the redrawing of the political landscape in Chicago by aldermen and alderpersons, as I should say, clinging to their strongest voter base by whenever they do a ward map redraw. It's essentially an opportunity for the alderman to preserve his constituency so he doesn't lose half of it. And it's a political game. We went from having 5 or 6 wards in Chicago in the 1830s to 35 wards. And then by 1920, the final 15 wards were inserted so that we have 50. And what we have are essentially 50 political fiefdoms that are mostly carved up along ethnic and racial lines. And you have a city council composed of 50 special interests, often at odds with each other. New York City found a way of reducing the size of its council, and I think in Chicago we perhaps have the most unwieldy system of government, because you have essentially 50 nations represented in 50 wards of the city.
They're often referred to as like 50 little mayors.
Yes, and that reflects the true nature of Chicago politics, with the exception of Richard J. Daley and maybe a handful of other mayors. Real power has traditionally and historically rested with the aldermen, the committeemen, and the operatives in each ward. We had a very decentralized form of government up until the time of Richard J. Daley. Mayors were mostly figurehead persons, but the decision-making rested in the strong council, weak mayoralty form of government. And even to this day, that persists. Richard J. and perhaps his son Richard M. Are the two notable exceptions to that historic layout of governance.
Well, there's a gerrymandering, of course, within the 50 wards, but what about the 77 Chicago community areas?
Well, I think those really are just really a reflection of the interest in tourism. The city tends to promote itself along its diversity, along with local attractions that are found. The 77 communities all have neighborhood names. Some are better known than others. You have Garfield Park, you have Lincoln Park, Hagwish, Shorish Village up on the northwest side. Some were named after architects. For example, Shorish and his unique housing that he built in the 1930s and 40s. Bucktown, which I think is perhaps one of the most colorful nicknames of any Chicago neighborhood. You kind of get a sense, well, what is Bucktown? You think of, oh boy, a tough, gritty, urban, industrial neighborhood, but that is rapidly gentrifying and it's losing that cachet, because city neighborhoods, to me, I always looked upon them as halfway houses. One group comes in, another group goes out. That has been the ethnic makeover of Chicago for generations. One neighborhood, for example, the area called Little Hell, which was just west of the Chicago History Museum, was an Italian enclave in the 1870s, rife with crime and tenements and all kinds of social problems. By the 1950s and 60s, it had evolved into Cabrini Green, which had the same social problems and crime problems, only now it was a predominantly African-American area. So what you see is, you see one group coming in, one group coming out. The old white ethnic impoverished neighborhoods, essentially those people would live there for maybe 2 generations, their children would disperse and they would move out to the suburbs. And so neighborhoods would tend to implode after a period of time. Property values would rise and they would sink and they would rise again. But the pocket was immediately filled by newly arrived immigrants, more recently from Latin America, from South America, from Asia. But the interesting thing is, the one conundrum to all this is that they remain almost little islands, segregated by culture, by speech, by traditions. So we still have a segregated city, but with different groups of segregation. That's the remarkable thing to all of this.
And this segregation, do you believe, or do you know how it was planned?
How it was planned?
Mm-hmm.
I think the determining factor was affordability and economics. Everything is driven by money. And so poor neighborhoods often remained poor from one group to the next, simply because the rents were low. And one ethnic group from Europe, for example, would come in, they would settle, and they would send letters back to their families in Europe, and they say, oh, come to Chicago. And then an ethnic community would form, such as the Swedish community, which I know a lot about because I'm Swedish, where the language was spoken. And people from Europe felt comfortable moving there because they're going to be with their own people who speak the same language, and they're going to be served by grocers and businesses that are of the same ethnic group. And so these neighborhoods become enclaves, and the footprint of many of them still is there today, even though the second and third generations and fourth generations have all moved out. Ukrainian Village is one great example. You still have Ukrainian stores there. It still has its Ukrainian parishes and Ukrainian restaurants. But how many actual Ukrainians still live there? The imprint has never really disappeared from these ethnic enclaves. And that's, I think, really contributes to Chicago being considered the most international of all American cities.
Most international and kind of most segregated as well. Your book, hang on just a second, let me get into this.
Tales of Forgotten Chicago?
Yeah, the Gambler King of Clark Street.
Oh,
yes. So you wrote about Michael C. McDonald and how he created the Chicago's democratic machine. However, when he created it, that was a little bit before. And what years was that? And then afterwards, these were the years before the two Mayor Daley's. So how did that democratic machine work in the years between Michael C. McDonald and the two Mayor Daley's?
Michael C. McDonald is perhaps the most interesting political figure of them all. He is the forgotten father in many respects of the Chicago democratic machine that we know today. Chicago, to understand McDonald and his world, it's important to understand that in the 1860s and 70s, Chicago was pretty much divided along two social classes: the blue blood Anglo-Saxons of wealth and attainment in the business districts that they served, and the blue collar ethnic drinking peoples of Europe who were mostly impoverished, but they brought with them a strong desire to enjoy their continental Sundays in taverns and saloons the one day of the week where they weren't working, and to kind of recreate that German and Italian and Polish sense of camaraderie. Now, the blue bloods looked upon the drinkers as violating the laws of nature and God, and how dare they drink and create social problems and commit crime, and so you had a sharp socioeconomic divide between the haves and have-nots. McDonald organized, and he was a saloon owner and he was a professional gambler, and he organized the neighborhood working class wards into strong voting constituencies aligned with the Democratic Party of Chicago. He ratcheted together a collection of like-minded politicians from each of the wards, and over time, he built a powerful organization of ward operatives. McDonald never held an office. He was a kingmaker behind the scenes. He had a lavish downtown casino at Clark and Monroe, which he called the Store. But he controlled through the bail bonding processes of individuals who were arrested for petty larceny, theft, prostitution, gambling, intoxication, so forth. He created bonding processes to get these individuals out of jail quickly. He built an organization of aldermen who supplied jobs called patronage. And it really occurred over a 30-year period from the early 1870s up through the early 20th century. McDonald was eclipsed in power by the end of the 1890s by a succession of future ward bosses whose lineage you can trace beginning with McDonald and continuing all the way up to the era of the two Daleys. You had Roger Sullivan, whose high school, there's a high school on the north side of Chicago named after Roger Sullivan. He was a kingmaker and boss of the machine. George Brennan in the 1920s, Jake Arvey in the 1930s, and on. You always had powerful Democratic operatives, and essentially they controlled the patronage and the jobs, which was the key to everything. If a politician got you a job in city government, you owed that politician your loyalty come election day. And gradually, by the 1960s, the Republican Party had been mostly eliminated. from Chicago. And this process began with this larger than life, colorful figure named Mike McDonald. The interesting anecdote to McDonald is this. He controlled the city. He knew everybody. He elected several mayors, including Carter Harrison, and yet he had no control over his private life. His first wife ran off with a Catholic priest in 1889. He divorced her. The second wife, a much younger woman and the daughter of a rabbi, took up and had a romantic affair with a young man half her age in 1907, broke McDonald's heart. And she ended up murdering her lover in a sensational trial that broke McDonald's heart. And a reporter said, Mike, how could you have let this happen, to have two of your wives end up this way? And the first wife ran off with a Catholic priest. And Mike said to the reporter, if you can't trust your wife and you can't trust your priest, who can you trust in life? Of course, he also said, there's a sucker born every minute. He's credited with that famous quote. And he led such a ribald, colorful life. And nobody had ever done a biography of him before. And that was just a real joyful, fun, and interesting project to work on. It was published by Southern Illinois University Press in 2009.
This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us via Zoom, Richard Lindberg, author and alumna of Northeastern Illinois University, NEIU, and also with us, Bill Morton, president of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce and WZRD broadcaster. Richard, when you spoke about the oral histories and then how you got opinions and that you rather stick with opinions that give color to the history that you're writing about, was there any we understand that the events for McDonald happened a long time ago, but were you able to get any oral histories for that book? Because how were you able to research it? That was so long ago, and you were able to dig deep.
Well, actually, when I wrote the book, there was nobody alive that I could find that was related to McDonald. However, after the book came out, and this always seems to happen to an author, that the best material you can acquire comes after the book is published. I was contacted by a man by the name of John Mia, who worked at the Board of Trade, and he called me excitedly after he read the book, and he told me that he was the great nephew of Mike McDonald's sister in Chicago. And I was so stunned to hear that there was even a living relative. And I met up with him, and he produced a small antique pearl handle revolver. He said, this little revolver is what Mike McDonald had given to his sister Jenny, because he said at the time, that this is a family legend, that nobody walks around Chicago without protection. So be sure to keep this little, I mean, the little pistol was so small, if you fired it, I actually think the bullet would have bounced off of somebody's chest, but he still held this connection to the Mike McDonald era, and it was quite remarkable. Then I met family members from Ohio of Mike's first wife, Mary Noonan McDonald, and they were several generations removed. This is the woman who ran off with the Catholic priest, and they came to Chicago with a box of books, and they were so excited that I had written a story, and they asked me to sign all these copies for them, for all of their relatives. So in the beginning, I could find nobody alive, but only after the book had come out did these individuals come forward. And that is really one of the joys of writing history, is when you can connect events from the distant past to the present and find a living connection to that generation. That in itself is one of the great inherent rewards of doing this kind of work.
Mhm. And when you mentioned that the two dailies really vamped up the democratic machine. So what was it different? How was the democratic machine that was created by McDonald different from the democratic machine run by the two dailies? And afterwards, tell us about what the state of the democratic machine now.
Well, the lineage between McDonald and the dailies, at least up until the time of the new millennium, was a constant thread of one boss after another. But it must be understood that some of these ward bosses were more powerful than certain other ward bosses. So from the wards came the great party leaders, those who, the slate makers, who slated the judges, who appointed with the mayor the key persons who ran municipal government. Jake Arvey and his gang helped elect Mayor Ed Kelly in the 1930s. McDonald elevated Carter Harrison to 5 mayoralties in the 19th century. Roger Sullivan was also a kingmaker, but the Democratic Party would often split into factions. For example, Roger Sullivan was an enemy of Carter Harrison II. But Carter Harrison II also served 5 terms, but he was a blood sworn enemy of Roger McDonald. So even within the parties, you have coalitions in groups that were at odds with each other. In the more modern time, the 11th Ward and the 14th Ward were opposed on many issues. The 11th Ward were the Dailies, the 14th Ward were the Burkes. For several years, I was a speechwriter for Alderman Ed Burke up until 2018 when the troubles for him started. And there were colorful stories about Ed and Richie Daley, the second Daley, and how his boys, they played in the basement on the Daley home on Low Avenue in Bridgeport. And as young men in college attending Loyola Law School, they would commute together and they would ride. They would drive their cars to, to DePaul University, where they got their degrees. Both of them are alums of DePaul, and they were friends until 1980. They were close, but then Ed decided to challenge Richie Daley for Cook County State's attorney in the primary, and there developed a schism after that. So within the machine, you have factions, and today you see it in Chicago City Council. You see, Mayor Lightfoot has her faction. Some of the aldermen on the south side and the southwest side are opposed to her, and they have their faction. So the balkanization that I talked about of the neighborhoods of Chicago is also reflected in the politics of the city. We have a balkanized city council right now. And even though we don't have a viable Republican Party, we might as well almost have 2 parties within the Democratic Party that are vying with each other and that are at odds with each other. This is the game that is played historically all through the history of this great city.
How did the Democratic Party hold itself together? Was it that it survived mainly through the skills of the fundraisers? What is the glue that holds the Democratic Party machine together?
In the era of patronage before the Shachtman Decree, jobs, jobs, and more jobs. Loyalty was purchased by the politicians through the dispensing of jobs in city government, police and fire, the municipal offices. The city of Chicago, I believe, is the city's largest employer. And before the Shachtman decrees came down in the 1970s, which severely curtailed the power of the alderman to appoint people to positions, this is how business was done. The Republicans could simply not compete because they didn't have the ethnic loyalty of what I call the tribalism of politics that the Democratic Party enjoyed. There's always been the old mantra in Chicago politics that it's very simplistic, and it's, I think, largely overstated, but the belief among the working classes has always been the Democrats are the party of the people, the Republicans are the party of big business. Okay, a lot of that has changed, but some of it's there's still truth in that statement, but that expression has held fast and true for everybody who goes into the voting booth in Chicago, in the belief that that the Democratic Party, you know, has services and serves the working person. The Republicans represent LaSalle Street. You know, yes and no. It's much more complex than that, but that has been the thread that has kind of held together the machine in Chicago. But I would argue that we can call it one big machine, but perhaps there's maybe 35 little machines operating inside the big machine. And again, it's all based on the interests of the voters that these aldermen serve.
After the Shackman decree, what happened to the Democratic machine?
Well, Shackman just made it an overt offense to hire based upon patronage and favoritism. But I suspect that there were ways around it. People still get hired in City Hall who are not part of the AFSCME union. I guess maybe you might want to call it aldermanic privilege. As long as these positions can be filled within a ward alderman's budget, you know, the system still exists. When you deal with something as large and as imposing and as complex as the Chicago city government, there still exists jobs and people who are still loyal and must remain loyal. But the difference is today, their jobs no longer depend upon going door to door on election day and handing out brochures or standing on street corners and handing out campaign information. That used to be a requirement of the job. If you worked for the city of Chicago, say you worked in the sewer department, come election day, you were expected to be out there or else participating on a ward level, talking to your neighbors and you know, and getting the vote out, as they used to say. By and large, that's an illegal process now, and that was the thing that Shackman really addressed, was the pay to play. You get a job and you pay back by doing political favors and campaigning for the organization, buying tickets to fundraising dinners, getting 10 of your friends and neighbors to buy tickets for a benefit dinner somewhere. That by and large has mostly ended as a result of Shackman.
Now, would that be what is known as the precinct captains currently?
Yes. Well, that was a function of the precinct captains in the old days. I think the role is much different now. Precinct captains today basically address concerns and problems with municipal service, garbage pickup, tree removal, things of that nature. But I remember quite clearly as a kid, the precinct captain would come to our door, you know, weeks before the election and have a handful of brochures and would ask you, well, how you doing? You know, what's going on? Everything okay? You know, and they would chit chat with you and then remind you. They would press into your hands the brochures and instructing you on how to vote come election day. And this was something that independent candidates and Republicans simply could not overcome because they didn't have the jobs to pass out. And that is really how we lost a two-party system in Cook County, at least in Chicago.
For the precinct captains, since they don't do that much of that kind of work now, are they still, do we still have many precinct captains, do you know?
Well, we do, but honestly, I couldn't tell you who my precinct captain is. He's never come to, he or she has never come knocking on my door. Uh, this again was a throwback to a different time when you knew your precinct captain, and they would, if you were having bad garbage pickup, or if there was some sort of nuisance in a neighborhood, they would try to address it. And now we don't have that anymore. The only political workers I see are outside the polls on election day, the little groups of men mostly standing outside the polling place, uh, drinking soda pop and chatting with one another, and then the signs are all around them. And I think to myself, well, I guess my precinct captain must be standing somewhere in that crowd. I honestly don't know who he is. And I really can't tell you really much what they do these days, because the system has changed so much.
So the
Before,
precinct captains would be the aldermen's liaisons, so to speak.
Yes, right, exactly. Um, uh, I think aldermen today are pretty receptive. They have ward meetings, they have their open office dates where the public can come in and talk to them directly. The ward office people are there to answer questions and address issues. You got a bad tree, forestry will come out and remove the tree, and then maybe a year or two will pass, and then you'll get a new tree put in eventually. But they're there to solve problems. You need a new garbage can in the back, they'll send one to you. And mostly they're pretty receptive. And I guess some aldermen are better than others. I can't complain about my alderman. I think he's done a very fine job. But essentially, they are the representatives and the precinct captains. And I think right now the term is ward superintendent, is the troubleshooter, and the ward superintendent is the person who will drive around the ward and look to see what's going on and report back and field complaints from the ward residents. So the term is a little bit different. I think ward superintendent is probably a better word now than precinct captain.
when we still have precinct captains, you mentioned that they would show up around election time. Does that mean that when it was not an election, how often do you see them?
You knew who they were, in the sense that you would get to know them through these front porch conversations you had with them. They would hand out their business cards, and they would say, "Oh, give us a call anytime you have an issue." And it became kind of a one-on-one relationship, so that you knew a person there representing your block, or maybe the 2 or 3 blocks within your precinct, that you could always turn to. So you had that one-on-one connection. And in many respects, the system was antiquated and old, and it went back to the 19th century, but it worked. I mean, it worked. And the other thing that they did, which was always notable, is the fact that if there was a death in the family, they would be there at the wake to pass on their condolences. And in the old days, if there was a family in want and were hungry, they would, deliver a turkey at Thanksgiving time or at Christmas time, and they would help find you your jobs if you needed it. So it really was almost kind of a familial relationship that you had in those days. In other words, you had somebody at your back, should there be a crisis. Somebody takes ill in the family, the precinct captain comes over and asks, "Well, what can I do to help here?" After patronage was ended, that kind of relationship mostly ended with it.
The precinct captain system and the democratic machine system. Do you have any idea? I know that we know that you write about the Chicago, but has this machine template been applied to other areas of the country, which you happen to know?
Across the major urban centers of the U.S., every big city at one time had a political machine. By and large, the urban areas in America vote Democratic, and the rural areas and hinterland tend to vote Republican. It is still that way today. You had major machines, the roof machine in San Francisco. You had a Cincinnati machine. You had Tammany Hall in New York City. You had the Michael Curley machine in Boston. In the Deep South, you had political operatives who were running. Machine politics, the heyday of it, really extended from the end of the Civil War up to the 1920s. Memphis was a notorious political machine. The Crump machine operated in Memphis. And these were controlled by men who were mostly white, ethnic, Irish, German, Polish, native born, first generation, second generation, and they clutched the political levers and operated with impunity until scandals began to emerge. In Kansas City, for example, the Prendergast machine, which spawned President Harry Truman, crumbled under a weight of graft and cooperation with the organized crime element of Kansas City. So one by one, the big city organizations tumbled by the time of the Great Depression and by World War II. Chicago, on the other hand, is an anomaly because it retained its power long after the corrupt patronage, gambler, organized crime consortiums that ruled these big cities in the past had disappeared under local and federal indictment.
Were the machines in other cities, were they based off of the Michael McDonald machine, or did they just develop on their own in those environments?
Well, McDonald had some influence in Washington, D.C. Incredibly, he had Oval Office meetings with two sitting U.S. presidents in the 1880s. But the model was adopted from city to city, closely paralleling each other's city. And many of them were run by Irish politicians. And how is that possible? Well, how do you explain that? Well, the simple explanation is that the Irish filled a political vacuum in the United States. They benefited by being able to speak the English language to begin with. And as a result of the Irish famine, the potato famine in the 1840s, millions of immigrants flooded into this country. They had understood politics through the historic fight for political autonomy against Great Britain. They were natural organizers. They gravitated into it. The blue bloods of society, the business classes, they wanted their sons to go into mercantile pursuits and make lots of money. It was politics was for many years considered a shameful profession to go after or to aspire to. So the scions of all these wealthy families turned their nose up on politics, and that left a political vacuum in the inner city districts, political districts of the large cities, and it was a vacuum that was filled mostly in the mid to late 19th century by Irish politicians and Germans. For many years, the two largest immigrant groups in Chicago, believe it or not, the Germans were number one and the Irish were number two. And that held for many, many years. So it was based on ethnicity. It was based upon religion. Most of the bosses of that era were Roman Catholic. And it was based upon patronage and a tolerance for the social vices of gambling, drinking, and tolerance of vice. The Democratic Party, if you were a political liberal in the 1870s and 80s, you were considered to be you were tolerant of allowing someone to go gamble their money away in a gambling den in downtown. Drink should not be denied to anybody who wants it. that was essentially the identity of a political liberal in 1880. Over time, the Democratic Party adopted, especially during the progressive era of the early 1900s, they took on a more important social role in addressing labor unionization, supporting labor unions, uh, uh, important measures like the Pure Food and Drug Act, uh, finding housing for homeless people, dealing with truancy in young offenders who ran into the law by setting up institutions where they could get job training. So the important social issues that the Democratic Party embraced really begins in the 1890s and escalates during the progressive era of the 1900s. But by but the old axiom the Republicans used to say in 1880 was that the Democrats were the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. In other words, rum, Democratic voters need to drink. Romanism, Roman Catholic. Rebellion, the Democratic Party was the party of the Confederates and slavery during the Civil War. So these three evils was the tag that was given to the Democratic machines by the reformers, who were mostly Republicans and social workers. And historically, the Republicans were the party of reform. And that held true well into the 20th century.
When did politics ever become respectable then? And was it at any time respectable before what you were describing of as people portraying politicians as imbibers and also not respectable?
Well, I think that the Kennedys gave politics a better cachet than it had before. The Lodge family, Henry Cabot Lodge of New England, attached a degree of respectability to politics, but it really went in the 20th century, particularly after World War I. There was an evolution that, especially in Chicago, that politicians and elected officials were mostly connected with saloons. Alderman owned a saloon. In fact, in 1900, Lincoln Steffens, who wrote The Shame of the Cities, said that he made a joke. He said he would walk into the Chicago City Council and he would yell out, "Hey, your saloon's on fire." And the entire city council would race for the doors. Kind of a standing joke, never happened, but it was apocryphal. By the 1930s, Jake Arvey once said that I encourage prospective candidates and office seekers to get a college degree, preferably in the law. So we saw a transformation from saloon owners and barkeeps being aldermen in the 1890s to having a more professional class of politicians by the 1930s who had gone to college, who were educated, and who, by and large, came from the legal profession. So it elevated from what they call saloon politics of the 19th century to a more dignified profession of the later 20th century. That's not to say that the old social cachets disappeared, because you don't see many Lakeshore Drive individuals, even today, or members who serve on various philanthropic boards in the city of Chicago, heads of corporations, running for office. There is still that certain odor of politics and a lack of respectability that discourages a lot of people from the blue-blooded society classes from engaging in what they might perhaps call the lower depths. But as mentioned earlier, politicians have elevated their game to the fact that now it's no longer acceptable really to run a saloon and become an alderman. you have outside business interests, granted, but most of them today are lawyers or have some related business, such as, for example, real estate law, which a number of aldermen are involved with.
Mhm. And you have described the kind of the state of the democratic machine now. However, it seems as if the aldermen find that their salary does not cover their what they need, and they often have to rely on, let's say, practicing law. What is the state of politicians now, such as aldermen? Uh, uh, how has it changed, and how has it changed from what you stated about the most aldermen being lawyers, or are they still mostly lawyers, or not?
Well, many of them are involved in property tax appeal. Uh, it's a very lucrative business, and there is no law in the books that prohibits an elected Chicago alderman from having an outside business interest. That should be clearly understood by people, that until that is amended by legislative fiat, an alderman can and will have an outside business interest, because the money they make as an alderman is likely not enough to support their family. Unfortunately, certain aldermen have diverted city business into their law practices, particularly with regard to real estate law. The alderman today, I think, is a less powerful figure than he was, say, 70 or 80 years ago. Each of them have their own allotted budget of money that they are given, that they can spend however they wish for improvements in their ward. Most of them use that money to repave streets that are full of potholes and falling apart. They can use that spend. It has a ceiling, so they don't have unlimited resource towards money beyond that, and they have to use that money judiciously for ward improvements that are necessary. They will often form coalitions to oppose certain mayoral initiatives. I think that this whole casino issue will be one of them, because this issue of casinos in Chicago has been going on since the early 1990s. And I think more recently, Mayor Lightfoot has seen much greater opposition among the 50 aldermen than she had at the beginning of her administration. It seems to me that she really is unable to please everybody. And of course, that's human nature. I mean, no matter who you are, you're not going to please everybody all the time. But if you can please a certain percentage, you can hang on to your job. I think that in many respects, she's been somewhat polarizing in her relations with certain aldermen in the wards, and it's an interesting dynamic. But the one thing that's been constant among Chicago machine politics historically is that it's the remarkable ability the machine has had to survive and endure, whereas in other big cities, those machines crumbled under the weight of graft and corruption. Our graft and corruption has always been there, but the machine has always survived it, and it's reinvented itself. It's gone from becoming a white ethnic machine controlled by white ethnic aldermen to I would say, mostly a minority-driven city council right now. But even now, as we see certain aldermen get indicted in the last 5 to 10 years, some of the old patterns still persist. And corruption is the great malevolent evil that seems to impact aldermen. I think the number is we've had 70 aldermen and city officials, 70 aldermen since 1970 or 1965, thereabouts, who have been indicted. Because there's still temptation there. There are still bribes to be received and favors to be dispensed, but yet through all of that, the voters keep returning these aldermen to office, and the machine endures although the face of the machine has completely changed.
Is there a relationship between the endurance of the machine with the fact that there are more indictments for corruption in Chicago and in Illinois versus other areas of the country?
Well, I think Transparency International ranks Illinois in the bottom 5 of U.S. states as far as corruption. I mean, Chicago, it is not unique to Chicago. We've had historical corruption scandals throughout the state of Illinois. I remember back in the early 70s, Secretary of State Paul Powell, when he died, they found shoeboxes full of cash in the closet of his hotel room in Springfield, and nobody could figure out where all that cash came from. You've had clouds of suspicion over and indictments of Governor George Ryan. Governor Dan Walker got into trouble after his administration ended. Going back to the 1920s, Governor Len Small went to prison in a scandal involving early release and paroles for criminals in the Illinois penitentiaries. So Illinois has a unique position it occupies in the hierarchy of governance in the United States, and that is, we have a history and a reputation of perhaps being one of the most corrupt states in the U.S., apart from maybe New Jersey and Mississippi, at least according to Transparency.
And so just to reiterate, so is it this stigma and perseverance of corruption, is that what makes the democratic machine, the political machine endure?
Well, its endurance, I think, is tied to its longevity and its continuing power. Certain politicians who've been ineffectual, and I won't mention their names, I read a number of political blogs all the time, and the one constant issue that comes up from a number of informed writers of these blogs is, why do people keep electing these corrupt politicians? Why do they get elected? Why? And you know, it's a head scratcher. I mean, if you have a qualified independent, a good government type who is aspiring to an office and gets buried in the election by an overwhelming vote count, what does that say about the voters of Chicago, who are ultimately responsible for putting individuals into office? But by the same token, it could be reasonably argued that the independent guy who somehow wins an office but has no organization in back of him or her, and no what we used to call clout, the famous term for power in Chicago, how effective are they going to be, or will they just end up being a one-term politician? There was a great movie in the 1940s called The Last Hurrah, with Spencer Tracy playing a city mayor, much like Michael Curley in Boston, where he took care of the entire city. By a wave of his hand, he could put food in the hands of people who were starving, and he could do this and he could do that. And the young up and comer manages to win an upset election, but he does not have the mechanism or the apparatus underneath him to do all those nice things that the old incumbent machine boss did before, because the machine boss's organization is crumbled. So where are we better served? And do the voters intuitively sense that if we stay with the status quo, we'll be better taken care of? Does that rule still apply today? That's the question that I always ask in the wake of spiraling property taxes that are hitting middle-class homeowners in Chicago very hard. Crime, which was something that the Chicago Police Department would be able to control over to some extent has run amok. People are afraid of getting on the subway, especially late at night, walking around downtown. My God, when I was younger, downtown was when at 2 o'clock in the morning, you'd feel perfectly safe downtown. Now I don't think anybody wants to be walking around downtown after 9 o'clock. I mean, this is how the world that I remember has changed in the city of Chicago within the last 20 years. So is the machine effective? I think that's a question that every voter must answer in his conscience.
Well, is it that the voter turnout is very low? Bill and I have served as election judges, and then we see that the voter turnout is very low. Is it that the voters who do turn out are those that are ushered out and reminded to go to the polls by the machine, and that's why the machine remains in power, and there is relatively no change because it is only the machine that is able to bring out the vote.
Well, I can't speak to how widespread the old process was of knocking on somebody's door and offering them a ride to the polls if they vote. I would imagine some of that might still be going on. I'm not sure. I do remember very well in 1983, when the late Harold Washington was running for mayor, in my white ethnic ward where I lived. I remember I had come to visit my mother at her home, and there was a precinct worker who came running up to her. She was going up the stairs. She'd just come home from the grocery store, and he said, "You have to. Did you vote today?" And she says, "Oh no, I didn't vote today. What good is it? What, it doesn't change anything." And in a frantic tone, he said, "Oh, you have to vote. You must vote. This is the most important election of them all." And really, it was because an African American was running for mayor of Chicago, and that white fear of what would happen, that the city would fall apart, came into play. That's the last time I saw it with my own eyes. But I would imagine that it still exists, but I just can't speak to that level of persuasion. I think that historically, non-presidential elections all across the country have lower voter turnouts unless there's some red hot issue that has the voters completely up in arms. I think there's people give a sigh of frustration and say, "What is it? My vote doesn't count. It doesn't matter. Things aren't going to change." And perhaps they're right. Things aren't going to change for the better. I mean, so it's that kind of frustration and apathy, I think, that helps perpetuate the careers of questionable politicians in the state of Illinois.
So where would you, after you've studied and wrote about the democratic machine through like over 100 years of history, where would you say the seat of power is now with the democratic machine?
That's a very good question. Under Rahm Emanuel and between the last Daley and Mayor Lightfoot right now, I would have said that the council continued to be the seat of power, that it was the powerful city council, weak mayor system of governance that prevailed in Chicago, as it did in most decades of our history, with the exception of the Daleys. Now, I'm not quite so sure. I think it still pretty much applies, although I think that our current mayor has shown to be a little more angry and adamant about issues that are of great importance to her. And she has really fought the city council in a degree that I have not seen, at least since the days of the late 60s, early 70s, when a coalition of independent-minded Democratic aldermen led by Dick Simpson and and Leon Dupre and a few others challenged the elder Daley for power, and made it rough for him for a couple of years, because the reform element of the city council in that era, during the Vietnam era, had emerged and had been pretty vocal. That was really the last time when I didn't see the harmony existing. That harmony today, I believe, is gone between the mayor and the city council. These are my opinions, and they don't necessarily reflect reality. That's just the way I tend to see it.
And Dick Simpson, who you mentioned, is that the same Dick Simpson who is a reporter?
No. He's a professor at the University of Illinois of political science. He was a young maverick in the late 1960s, hammering away against Richard J. Daley, cronyism, and the conduct of a number of his colleagues. And in those eras, he was quite fiery at that time, and would stand up and start yelling. But you know what? You know how Daley silenced his opposition in those days? In the city council on the second floor alcove, there's the communications center, and they would simply turn off the microphone of an alderman who was becoming belligerent during a city council meeting. He would be effectively silenced by a turn of the knob. The elder Daley would just look up at the room, make a nod, and then the microphone would go silent. That's how the machine stifled city council debate in those days. We don't have that kind of flamboyance and color anymore, but I do think that what we're seeing now is a much more resistant Chicago City Council than what we've had in many years.
So what role does fundraising play in this machine currently, would you say?
Well, there are still fundraising dinners, particularly for judges who are on the ballot. They all have fundraising dinners. Ward organizations sponsor it, and that's political reality, and it's been the nature of politics since the very beginning. There's a lot of awards dinners that politicians go to, black tie events, social affairs, and this is how the power brokers of Chicago, in the corporate world, the philanthropic world, the artistic world, this is how they integrate with the Chicago political figures. Real power in the city, I think, is still vested on LaSalle Street and among the museum board members, the Chicago socialites, the Lakeshore Drive group, museum trustees. That faction has to work in harmony with the political apparatus of Chicago. And through these various dinners and meetings and get-togethers, that's how they socially integrate with one another to exchange viewpoints and agendas that need to be pushed. So it's what I would call a cooperative political socio relationship that guides the city of Chicago. I've always clung to the belief that, and I've said it a number of times, that perhaps when you get down to it, there's really only 500 people in Chicago that really matter. And that's the power dynamic of the city.
Mm-hmm. And this apparatus of the museum trustees and the South Streets, has that been in place for a long time, or when did it begin?
Oh, it's been in place forever. LaSalle Street businesses, business people serve on museum boards. They serve on charitable fundraising drives. They're all socially integrated. They go to the same parties, the same restaurants. They travel in the same social circles. They go to each other's weddings and parties and birthdays and bar mitzvahs and whatnot. And many of them, have country homes up in Wisconsin and other places, and they all know each other. There's the group, the people we know versus the people we don't know, and ideally, to get inside the wall, you've got to become a person that we all know. That not only applies to politics, business, and philanthropy, it applies to the arts as well. Uh, as an author of 20 books, and I've come to realize, that the same is true in media. There's an insider media and there's an outsider media. And if you're an A-lister, you get invited to the literary ball. You're feted. You are honored. You are on every radio talk show, and again, it's a question. There's the haves and the have-nots, and this is the dynamic of Chicago, and it's the dynamic of New York City, of Los Angeles. Each of them have different cultural identifiers. Of course, Chicago is business. Los Angeles is film and entertainment. New York is politics and business and international. So those are the three centers of power. And Chicago, it's mostly business and media.
And media. Wow. So you have written about 20 books, right? You said,
Yes.
and which book was the most popular and sold the most copies?
Well, believe it or not, my best-selling book of all time was a book I did in 1998 called "Return to the Scene of the Crime: A Guide to Infamous Places in Chicago." It was pretty much the Rand McNally of crime scenes in Chicago. It was a fun book. I took the reader on tours of places where famous crimes occurred, and that book sold 20,000 copies, and it inspired a sequel called "Return Again to the Scene of the Crime." Even more infamous places in Chicago. We certainly have a number of famous places related to the underworld, and it was popular, and it really attracted national attention, and it helped get me to do all these bus tours for the Chicago History Museum. And the book, in the business, as they say, had legs. It went through a number of reprints, and even today I get contacted about it. And I told little stories in the book about each of these famous crimes, and where possible, I took then and now photos of the way the properties look now versus the way they looked when the crime occurred, and it had great reception. My more serious books, like The Gambler King of Clark Street, I did a book on the history of Chicago street gangs from the time of the 1840s up to 1990, called Gangland Chicago. That was a scholarly book that was published by Rowman and Littlefield. And none of these other books ever really attracted the interest or had the cachet that my two tourism crime scene books did. And I don't know what that says, but all of them, in every way, each of those books are very special to me. The McDonald book is among my favorite. I wrote a memoir of my life called Whiskey Breakfast: My Swedish Family, My American Life, about my rather unusual lineage, my Swedish father, and coming to Chicago and living, as an immigrant. And that book was published in 2011 by the University of Minnesota Press, and that is the one I'm most proud of. But each of those 20 books, they were a delight to write. The research process is my most favorite part of doing it. Not so much when the book comes out, because inevitably an author is always disappointed by the lack of reviews, the lack of attention. It's a common complaint in the writing world that you write a book, you spend years of research, and it debuts to deafening silence. That's what all of us endure, and we accept it. But if we didn't love writing and love the research, we wouldn't do it. But we choose to simply because we love it.
Have you written about the Devil in the White City and Mudgett? And have you visited the former murder castle that was repurposed and torn down and turned into a post office on campus?
Oh, yes, of course. I have the whole Holmes Mudgett story told in a book I did called Heartland Serial Killers, which came out in 2011. The full story is told. I do presentations on the Devil in the White City case. I do a lot of speaking to libraries, membership groups, institutions. I've spoken to Northeastern on one occasion. And yes, I cover that ground. I've been down there. Remarkably, there's a building on 63rd Street, 2 blocks west of where the castle stood, that survives and is an exact replica of the Holmes Castle. It's not the castle, but if it's still standing today, it's identical to the way that the castle was built from the outside. I think it's boarded up. It's a derelict property, but I was stunned when I saw it. You just go west of 63rd on 63rd and you'll see it. So yes, I do all of that stuff, and the Holmes case has really become interesting.
Bill has also visited the Gacy, where the Gacy home used to be. Is that in the Chicago neighborhood? Which neighborhood was it?
The Holmes building?
The Gacy, John Wayne Gacy.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's in Norwood Park Township, right off of Cumberland on Summerdale Avenue. The Gacy property was torn down in 1979, and there's a new house on the location with a different address. It's a beautiful suburban ranch home. And the remarkable thing about when you drive down that street and you look at those houses, how close they are to each other and how small that block really is. And you just wonder how it was possible for John Wayne Gacy to commit those heinous crimes without the neighbors detecting. It's remarkable. I'm doing a bus tour for the History Museum covering the northwest side of Chicago at the end of November. And that's one of the locations I'll take the bus by that property. And John Wayne Gacy's boyhood home is also located in the Portage Park, Cragen neighborhood. That building, it's an old bungalow, still stands. And also on that northwest side tour is the hotel where O.J. Simpson fled to the night after he allegedly murdered Nicole Brown Simpson. He came to Chicago for a golf outing, and that today is it's a Holiday Inn overlooking the Kennedy Expressway.
That's on Cumberland, correct? Where he supposedly dropped the knife or something?
Yeah, he rented a room, and the way the story went is that he was notified by a desk, and he said, quote, "I went bonkers." He cut himself on a drinking glass that he smashed, and he cut himself badly, and he wrapped his hand with a towel. And later, after all this went down, they tried to auction off the Gideon Bible, the broken glass, the bloody towel, and other items from that room in a public auction. The promoters of this event thought it was going to raise thousands of dollars, and actually it raised $1,700. That was all. Really kind of a tawdry public relations spectacle it was, but that hotel has undergone several different ownerships since 1994.
Getting a little bit out there towards that direction, what about the history of O'Hare?
Well, it has a great history. It was called Orchard Field during World War II. They were manufacturing airplanes for combat there. It was surrounded by houses, and they had a couple of short runways. And then after the war, it was decided by the political powers that be to turn it into a commercial airport. And with the death of Butch O'Hare, which in itself is an interesting story, they decided to open it as O'Hare Field in 1949. It became an international airport in 1955. But but it was essentially truck farms and scattered houses, and it was a plant to build bombers during World War II. There was a thought of calling it the Fort Dearborn Airport, but there was public sentiment for Butch O'Hare, who had been shot down near Tarawa in the South Pacific during World War II. And there is a gangster connection to that because Butch O'Hare's father was Ed O'Hare, and he ran several dog tracks for the Capone mob in the 1930s. And the story goes is that because of Ed O'Hare's unsavory reputation, son Butch could not get an appointment to the Naval Academy. He aspired to become a naval combat pilot, but he needed a letter of recommendation from a well-placed political source or anybody in a position of influence to recommend him for an appointment. And in return for this agreement, the senior O'Hare became an informant for the government in its case against Al Capone, and much of the ledgers and printed documents and income statements were provided by Ed O'Hare. And Capone went to prison in 1931. And just before Capone was scheduled to be paroled in 1939, he had received word of O'Hare's betrayal, and Ed was shot down in his car on the west side in a blaze of gunfire as he approached a red light near Rockwell Avenue in what was the old Valley District of Chicago. And he kind of gave his life for his son. And a congressman from St. Louis, Missouri, signed the letter of recommendation, and Ed went on to become, Butch went on to become a war hero. And that really is the origins of how we have O'Hare Field today.
What was your most difficult book project?
Oh gosh. Well, I'm doing some corporate histories as on a freelance basis, and just recently I finished off on a history book for the North Dakota Farmers Union Mutual Insurance Company, headquartered in Jamestown, North Dakota. Because of COVID, I had to write this book and was unable to travel up to North Dakota to interview anybody. And plus, the fact was I'm completely unfamiliar with how the National Farmers Union worked or how an insurance company works. And with no access to interviews or to even archival material, I wrote this book, doing mostly phone interviews and just teaching myself about this business. And I produced the book, and it's going to be published this year sometime. But it was a hard slog for me because unfamiliarity with the subject matter and the inability to meet the people I needed to talk to and interview or look at the archives at their headquarters office made it almost impossible. But somehow I got through it. And I figure if I can do that, I can write anything.
Were you commissioned for the book?
Yes, I'm a freelance book author for the Donning Company in Missouri, and they engaged me to write institutional histories. And as a point of fact, the Northeastern history was published by Donning, and I was the writer that Bernie Brommel had wanted me to do. As mentioned earlier, Bernie had pressed the university for me to do this book, and we found Donning as the publisher and signed a contract with Donning, and the book was produced and published in 2017. And since that time, I've done 3 other Donning projects.
With this Northeastern Illinois University book, were there other versions?
No, this was an original book. It's the first institutional history to be published in book form. There were several pamphlets that Northeastern has in their archives. One was written by Duke Frederick, professor of history. Duke has since passed away. He wrote an abbreviated pamphlet about how Northeastern was organized in 1960, the cutover from the normal school in Englewood to the early years of Northeastern in 1960 to 63. And that was really the only primary document that I had to look at, but it didn't cover anything much beyond the 60s or anything before 1960. So Duke's work was helpful, but it really was an examination of every archival document that I could find in their history center, plus the numerous interviews I did with faculty and administration and students to get the book going. So I like to think that this book will become a template for any other future Northeastern histories, because up until that time, there simply had not been one.
This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM, and we have with us via Zoom Richard Lindberg, author and alumna of Northeastern Illinois University, NEIU, and we also have Bill Morton, president of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce. Richard, let's do a community assessment with you. WZRD Chicago, being a nonprofit radio station, must be responsible to the community we serve. WZRD is mandated to file quarterly issues with the FCC on non-entertainment, community-focused programming. We like to assess the community for these quarterly issue topics with 3 questions. First, what is most important to you? Not necessarily in your writing, but what is most important to you as Richard Lindberg?
Oh boy. Oh, well, I guess I would, on the highest road possible to take, I would like to think that it's important to me for my books to reach an audience, to inspire people to read about Chicago history, to understand Chicago history, and find some enjoyment from it, and perhaps to inspire younger writers to pursue the study of history with an eye upon publication. I guess that is my highest professional ideal.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. What long-term problem must we address?
In terms of what, society or?
Yes, what is what you feel in your life and in the world is the most important problem? What long-term problem must we address?
I think, and I strongly believe that we have to do a better job of bridging communities in this country. I've always said Chicago is very balkanized along racial, ethnic, religious, and social lines. At no point in my lifetime can I remember an era that is more fractured politically than what we are living through right now. The sharp divide between the political parties, between conservatives and liberals, between white and black, between every other ethnic group, with internal differences, racial hatred. This could ultimately be the doom of our society if we fracture into splintered self-interest groups. I have great alarm by this. And along with that, I think we need more effective bipartisan political cooperation. The Republican and Democratic parties have splintered and raced off into far left and far right corners of their political spectrum. We are losing the middle. And if we lose the middle, historically, they say things tend to fall apart. The Democratic and Republican parties of yesteryear really no longer exist. We don't have centrist politicians anymore. They're a disappearing, dwindling breed. And we have radicalization on both the left and the right. And I don't think that is going to serve any useful purpose, because it's just going to drive people further apart and polarize what is already a deeply divided society.
What problem must be resolved now?
The immediate problem I think we need to resolve right now is our economy. We cannot continue to see this kind of inflation spiraling. It's going to impact hard the people who can least afford it, economically distressed people, the middle class in particular. Gas prices, but more alarmingly, the price of food is becoming outlandish. I think this is the most immediate problem at hand that this administration needs to address in an effective way. We cannot spend our way out of inflation. There has to be some give and take on this issue, and otherwise we will hurtle straight forward into a recession, if not a depression. And that's one of my greatest fears right now.
Well, thank you so much, Richard Lindberg, for joining us on WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM today and sharing with us your prolific work and your deep knowledge of all things Chicago and Northeastern Illinois University.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Bill, for joining in on the conversation and the discussion. And Northeastern is very dear to my heart. I have both of my degrees from Northeastern. I served on the alumni board for a few years, and I have great fondness for all of my faculty mentors and colleagues from this great university.
Oh, actually, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. I really do appreciate it. And all of your history and your stories. And you answered all of my questions. So I appreciate all of that, of course.
Richard, if you don't mind, there is one more question that I just thought of. Do you have any insight on notable past Student Government Association presidents, SGA presidents?
Well, I wish I could say that, but I don't. I was not a part of student government when I was an undergraduate, and I am sure they all do a fine job. They did a fine job back then. There were a lot of political differences in those years that I remember so vividly, and not everybody got along, but somehow the student government was always effective. And doing the course of research on this book, studying through the various issues of the latter years of the 80s, 90s, and into the new millennium, I saw that the student government served most capably and maintained its degree of independence from the university, and always produced issues and delivered on issues of import. And my congratulations to all of them.
Thank you so much, Richard Lindberg, and thank you so much, Bill Morton of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.